few cocktails, and not think about anything back home. He'd double-checked everything before leaving, locked the house, set up security cameras, even had his neighbor, Tom, keep an eye on things. His property, a beautiful 2-acre lot on the outskirts of an HOA-run community, was his pride and joy. It had taken years of work and countless arguments with the HOA to get approvals for small projects like landscaping and fencing, but he had done it. The land was his, fair and square. But the moment he landed back home, something felt off. As he pulled into his driveway, he noticed a for sale sign staked right into his front lawn. At first, he thought it was some kind of mistake, maybe a prank or a misplaced sign meant for a different house. But no! The sign had his address on it, and right below, it said, Prime Land, HOA Authorized Sale. Contact Karen at 555 XXXXXX. Jake felt a cold rush of anger. Karen, of course, it had to be her. She was the president of the HOA and had been a thorn in his side since the day he moved in. If there was a rule to enforce, she found a way to twist it against him. If there was a fee to be collected, she made sure he paid every cent. And now she was trying to sell his land while he was away. Jake jumped out of his car, ripped the sign out of the ground, and stormed toward his front door. Everything seemed intact. No broken windows, no signs of forced entry. But when he checked his mailbox, he found a thick envelope stuffed with HOA violation notices, warnings, and, at the bottom, a formal notice of property seizure. His hands shook as he flipped through the documents. Apparently, while he was on vacation, the HOA had decided that his property was abandoned due to an obscure bylaw that stated if a property was left unattended for more than 30 days with no active maintenance, it could be reclaimed by the HOA for community use or sale. Jake was furious. This made no sense. He had security cameras running, a neighbor checking in, and absolutely nothing in the bylaws about seizing an actual house. It was meant for empty lots that had been overgrown or left to rot for years. But Karen had conveniently reinterpreted the rules. Without wasting a second, Jake stormed over to Karen's house. He didn't bother knocking. He banged on her door hard enough that it probably rattled the windows. After a moment, the door swung open, and there she was. Karen, the middle-aged tyrant with her perfectly styled blonde bob, smug expression, and a cardigan that looked like she had just stepped out of a Stepford Wives meeting. "Oh, Jake," she said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "Welcome back. I was wondering when you'd get home. I hope your trip was relaxing. What the hell is this?" Jake shoved the documents toward her. "You're trying to sell my property? On what grounds?" Karen gave an exaggerated sigh. "Oh, Jake, I told you that you needed to keep up with HOA regulations. The board voted, and we deemed your land abandoned under Section 4C of the HOA agreement. Since you left for an extended period with no maintenance, we had the right to reclaim it. You should have been more responsible." Jake clenched his fists. "That's complete bullshit, Karen. I had a neighbor watching my place. My cameras prove I had visitors. There was nothing wrong with my land." "Well," Karen said sweetly, "the board disagreed. And besides, the listing has already received offers. If you'd like, we can discuss an arrangement where you buy it back at a premium, of course." Jake felt his blood boil. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was premeditated theft. "I'm calling my lawyer," he said, voice low with anger. Karen just smirked. "Go ahead," she said, crossing her arms. "But I'd be careful if I were you. You signed the HOA contract when you moved in. Everything we've done is legal." Jake had never wanted to punch someone more in his life. But instead of giving her the satisfaction, he turned on his heel and walked away. He wasn't going to let this slide. As soon as he got back to his house, he called his lawyer, James, a no-nonsense guy who had helped him in the past with minor HOA disputes. But the moment Jake explained what was happening, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Jake," James said slowly, "this isn't just a violation. This is fraud." "Exactly," Jake snapped. "So what can we do?" I'll need to go through the HOA contract, but from what you're saying, it sounds like Karen manipulated the rules to make it look legal, even though it absolutely isn't. If we can prove malicious intent, we can take this to court. Jake exhaled, trying to calm himself. How fast can we act? James hesitated. HOAs love red tape, and Karen's banking on you not fighting back. If she already has buyers lined up, she's going to try and close fast. We need evidence that she acted in bad faith. Jake gritted his teeth. He already knew where to start. His security cameras. If Karen or anyone from the HOA had been on his property while he was gone, he'd have proof. He pulled up the footage on his laptop, fast-forwarding through days of empty recordings, until he saw something that made his stomach drop. Karen and 2 other HOA board members walking through his yard, taking pictures, making notes, and, most damning of all, placing the for sale sign in the ground themselves. She had been planning this from the start. Jake took a deep breath. Karen had made a huge mistake, and he was about to make sure she regretted it. Unraveling the scheme. Jake barely slept that night. His mind was racing with possibilities. Ways to fight back. Ways Karen could have manipulated things even further, and most importantly, how to ensure she didn't get away with it. He knew one thing for sure. He needed evidence. Real, undeniable proof that Karen and the HOA had deliberately engaged in fraud. The security footage was a good start, but it wasn't enough. He needed more. At sunrise, he grabbed his laptop, transferred the video files to a USB drive, and drove straight to his lawyer's office. James, a sharp-eyed man in his late 40s, met him in the conference room, his expression serious as he watched the footage. "This is damning," James muttered, pausing the video at the moment Karen planted the "for sale" sign in Jake's yard. "It proves they were actively involved in listing your property without your consent. But we need a paper trail." Jake leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "I need to see the official HOA meeting records, the sale listing documents, and any emails or communications regarding the sale of your land. If Karen filed any false paperwork, that's our smoking gun." Jake exhaled. He had an idea of where to start. The HOA was notorious for sloppy record-keeping. They kept digital copies of meeting minutes, but hard copies were usually filed in Karen's home office. That meant one thing. He had to get inside. The break-in, sort of. Jake knew Karen was obsessed with appearances. Every Saturday morning, like clockwork, she attended a ladies' brunch with other HOA wives at the country club, which meant she'd be out of the house for at least 2 hours. So, on Saturday, Jake parked a few houses away, waiting until she left. The second she pulled out of her driveway, he moved. He wasn't planning on breaking in. He wasn't an idiot, but he did know that Karen often left her office window unlocked. She'd even complained about it at a meeting once, laughing about how safe the neighborhood was. Jake walked around the side of her house and, sure enough, the window slid open without resistance. Idiot, careful not to disturb anything, he climbed inside. The room was immaculate, with shelves of perfectly labeled binders. He scanned them quickly, HOA budgets, complaint records, meeting minutes. Then he saw it, a folder labeled property seizures. Heart pounding, he flipped it open and immediately found his name. His property had been listed as abandoned based on a forged notice claiming multiple HOA members had witnessed its neglect. The signatures at the bottom? Fake. And worse. There was already a pending contract to sell his land to a developer for nearly triple its value. Jake took pictures of everything. He didn't take the files. If Karen noticed something missing, she'd get suspicious. But photos? She wouldn't even know they existed until it was too late. He climbed back out the window, heart still racing, and made his way back to his car. This was it. He had her. The neighbor's turn. Jake knew he couldn't do this alone. So he went to the one group of people Karen hadn't counted on, his neighbors. The HOA was universally hated. Everyone had a story about Karen's power trips, from outrageous fines for unauthorized holiday decorations to threats of eviction over minor infractions. If he could rally enough people, He could turn this from a legal battle into a full-blown HOA revolt. Jake reached out to Tom first, his next-door neighbor. When he showed him the evidence, Tom's reaction was immediate fury. "This is criminal," Tom spat. "She's been pulling this crap for years, but this is theft." Within a few hours, a dozen homeowners were gathered in Jake's living room, some of them flipping through copies of the fake documents he had uncovered. One woman, Mrs. Patel, a retired accountant, gasped as she recognized a name on the contract. "That's the same developer who bought my sister's property," she said, shaking her head. She had to sell because of code violations Karen kept fining her for. It was a setup. That's when it hit Jake. This wasn't just about him. Karen had likely been running the scam for years, finding ways to legally force people out of their homes, and then selling the properties to developers for a massive profit. And now, she was finally about to get caught. The setup. Jake's lawyer, James, advised him to stay quiet while he worked on filing a lawsuit. But Jake had a better idea. Instead of fighting Karen head-on, he was going to make her expose herself. With the help of his neighbors, he staged a fake acceptance of the sale. He left a message on Karen's voicemail, pretending to be tired of fighting and asking how he could speed up the process. Sure enough, Karen fell for it. Within hours, she sent an email outlining the final steps, including instructions to sign away his rights for a modest compensation and a request to keep this discreet to avoid upsetting the community. Jake smiled. He had everything he needed. The HOA meeting from hell. The next HOA meeting was packed. Neighbors who never attended showed up, some of them whispering about Jake's situation. Karen, oblivious, took her usual spot at the front. "All right, let's get started," she said, clearing her throat. "First on the agenda." "Actually," Jake interrupted, standing up, "I'd like to discuss something before we begin." Karen narrowed her eyes. "Jake, this isn't the time." "Oh, I think it is." He pulled a stack of papers from his bag and held them up for everyone to see. "I have evidence that you tried to sell my property illegally, that you forged signatures, that you've been running a scam to push people out of their homes for years." The room fell silent. Karen's face turned ghost white. "That's absurd." Jake clicked a button on his laptop. The projector behind Karen suddenly lit up, playing the security footage of her and the board members planting the for sale sign. Murmurs turned into shouts. "You lied? You tried to steal his land? What else have you been hiding?" Karen panicked. She tried to turn off the projector, but Tom, grinning, stood in front of it. "I don't think so," he said. Then James, Jake's lawyer, stood up. "I represent Mr. Carter," he said, "and as of this morning, a lawsuit has been filed against you and the HOA for fraud, forgery, and illegal property seizure." The color drained from Karen's face. "You can't do this," she whispered. Jake just smiled. "Oh, but we can." And just like that, her house of cards began to crumble. The ultimate payback. The HOA meeting had turned into a full-blown riot. Homeowners who had been silent for years were suddenly shouting, demanding explanations, demanding Karen's resignation. Some were furious over the fraudulent property seizures, while others were just now realizing how much they had been scammed through excessive HOA fees, fines, and shady emergency assessments Karen had imposed over the years. Karen, for the first time ever, was speechless. Jake watched with satisfaction as her carefully curated power structure collapsed around her. But this was far from over. Exposing her in front of the entire HOA was step one. Now, he needed to bury her completely. The fallout begins. The next morning, the HOA board members, minus Karen, called for an emergency meeting. They were terrified. While Karen had orchestrated everything, some of them had signed off on the fraudulent documents without realizing what they were approving. They wanted damage control. Jake and his lawyer, James, attended the meeting, sitting across from the board in Karen's usual spot. It was poetic. "Let's be clear," James started, setting a thick folder of evidence on the table. "This isn't just an HOA dispute anymore. We have forged documents, fraudulent property seizures, and clear proof of malicious intent. This is a criminal matter now. One of the board members, an elderly man named Richard, sighed and rubbed his temples. Jake, we had no idea. Jake cut him off. I don't buy that. You're on the board. You signed off on at least 3 of these fraudulent property sales. Either you're complicit, or you're too incompetent to be here. Richard's face darkened, but he didn't argue. Another board member, Lisa, cleared her throat. What do you want? Jake leaned forward. First, Karen is out, officially. She never steps foot in another HOA meeting again. They all nodded immediately. Second, I want every single one of her fraudulent property seizures reversed. If she forced someone out, I want them compensated, with interest. Lisa hesitated. That might require legal proceedings. Then start them, Jake said flatly. Richard exhaled. Fine. And the third thing, Jake smirked. I want a full financial audit of the HOA. Every fee, every fine, every dollar that Karen has touched in the last 10 years. Silence. They all exchanged nervous glances. We'd have to hire an independent auditor, Lisa said hesitantly. Do it, Jake said. Because if you don't, I'll make sure every homeowner here sues this entire board for negligence. Lisa swallowed. All right, we'll start the process. Jake stood up. Good. And while you're at it, freeze Karen's access to all HOA funds. Richard finally spoke up. Why? Jake's smirk widened. Because Karen's been stealing money, and we're about to prove it. The legal storm hits. Over the next 3 weeks, the fallout was catastrophic for Karen. The audit revealed that she had embezzled nearly $300,000 from HOA funds over the last 6 years. She had inflated fines, overcharged residents, and even created fake contractor fees to funnel money into a personal slush fund. She had been accepting bribes from developers to push homeowners out and sell their land. It didn't take long for the police to get involved. Jake was at home when he got a text from Tom. Turn on the news. Now, he flipped on the TV just in time to see Karen being led out of her house in handcuffs. Charges included fraud, forgery, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit real estate fraud. Jake laughed, but it got even better. A week later, James called him with an update. You're going to love this, he said. Karen's lawyer is negotiating a plea deal. Jake raised an eyebrow. For what? She's willing to fully confess if the court reduces her sentence. Jake whistled. That means she's guilty as hell. Oh, it gets better, James continued. Part of the deal involves her forfeiting all assets gained through illegal means. Jake leaned back in his chair. Meaning? Meaning the HOA is getting a massive settlement. And since you were the primary victim in this case, you'll likely be awarded significant financial damages. Jake grinned. Karen wasn't just going to jail. She was going bankrupt. The final nail in the coffin. With Karen out of the picture, the HOA board was desperate to fix their reputation. They implemented sweeping reforms, including dissolving Karen's old policies and refunding unfairly charged fines, implementing new voting systems so that no single person could ever hold absolute power again, offering buyouts to homeowners who had been unfairly pressured into selling. But the best part? The HOA settled with Jake out of court. James handled the negotiations, and by the time everything was finalized, Jake walked away with a 6-figure payout, more than enough to cover legal fees and then some. The first thing he did with the money, he bought Karen's old house at a foreclosure auction. And just to be petty, he turned it into a community garden. When the project was finished, he invited the entire neighborhood over for a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Karen, now broke, unemployed, and a convicted felon, wasn't there. But Jake made sure to leave a sign on the front gate for her, just in case she ever drove by. It read, "Welcome to the Karen Memorial Garden. A place for growth, not greed." And with that, Jake finally got the last laugh.